Dr. Elias Monroe sat back in his chair, nursing a cup of stale coffee aboard the remote space station Horizon Outpost. He wasn't expecting much excitement for the day, having spent the past few months stitching up minor wounds, administering vaccines, and attending to routine checkups of the station's diverse occupants. It wasn't glamorous work, but Monroe had built a reputation as a physician who thrived under pressure. Known for his willingness to experiment and solve the unsolvable, he'd treated injuries from species others wouldn't dare touch, yet nothing could have prepared him for the request that arrived that afternoon. A loud chime echoed through the sterile medical bay. Monroe sighed, set his coffee down, and turned toward the console. A royal-looking alien figure appeared as a hologram above the screen, long, insect-like limbs folded with formality, and regal, glimmering robes draped around a thin frame. Monroe squinted. He recognized the race from brief medical seminars. The Azara. They were elusive, dignified, and impossibly mysterious, their monarchy never interacting with humans unless absolutely necessary. The holographic figure spoke in an elegant but urgent voice, a translator device seamlessly turning their words into English. Dr. Elias Monroe, you have been summoned by the High Court of the Azara. Our queen has fallen gravely ill. No other medical personnel in the galaxy have managed to stabilize her. We have exhausted our options. Monroe straightened. I'm honored, but I've never treated an Izaran before. I'm not familiar with your biology. The alien's antennae twitched, betraying its growing impatience. There is no time for hesitation. We have consulted our finest physicians. They failed. Your species' unconventional methods are our last hope. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Monroe knew this wasn't a request. It was an ultimatum. Either he accepted and faced the unknown, or the Queen, an essential political figure, would perish, likely throwing an entire sector of the galaxy into chaos. Monroe's training kicked in. The unknown was part of the job. And when life was on the line, failure wasn't an option. When do we leave? He asked. Within minutes, a sleek royal transport ship docked at the Horizon Outpost. The alien attendants were impatient, rushing Monroe aboard before he had a chance to pack more than the essentials: his portable medical kit, a handful of diagnostic devices, and a hasty injection of caffeine to steady his nerves. The ship's interior gleamed with an unsettling mix of sterile perfection and opulence. Velvet-like walls shimmered with strange bioluminescent patterns, casting eerie shadows across elegant statues of alien deities. The attendants led Monroe to a chamber where a small team of Izaran nobles stood, their expressions a mixture of worry and contempt. They eyed him as if he were some peculiar insect that had wandered into their sanctuary. Monroe could sense the unspoken disdain. Humans, with their lack of refinement, were only summoned when desperation forced it. The Queen lay in the center of the room, her body half submerged in an iridescent pool of translucent liquid that pulsed with faint light. Monroe approached, his trained eyes scanning the alien monarch. She was delicate, her body composed of intricate chitin plates that shimmered like stained glass. Beneath her smooth carapace, faint pulsations of life flickered, weak and erratic. Monroe crouched beside the pool, activating his handheld scanner. The readings were incomprehensible. Izaran biology was too alien for his equipment to interpret properly. He frowned and placed his hand gently against the Queen's chest plate. He felt warmth, but her pulse was sluggish. She wouldn't last long without intervention. "Do you have any medical records I can reference?" Monroe asked, glancing over his shoulder at the gathered nobles. One of the attendants, a tall and imposing figure, hissed in irritation. "Our physicians have already tried everything. Traditional methods have failed. We summoned you because humans thrive on improvisation. We expect results, not more questions." Monroe bit back a retort and refocused on the Queen. It was clear they hadn't brought him here to ask for advice. They expected a miracle. He adjusted his scanner to run a broader diagnostic, knowing it was a shot in the dark. While the device pinged futilely, Monroe took a closer look at the Queen's abdomen, noticing faint discoloration, a pale blue sheen where the chitin had cracked slightly. He placed a fingertip against it, feeling a subtle give beneath the surface. Fluid, probably internal, had begun to pool beneath the plates. "You said she collapsed suddenly?" Monroe asked, scanning the alien's faint responses to check for signs of internal injury. The royal advisor, an older Izaran with pale antennae, gave a curt nod. "Yes. She was in perfect health until this morning. Then, weakness set in rapidly. Our physicians could not explain it." Monroe's instincts buzzed. This wasn't just a simple illness. Something critical had ruptured internally, and if he didn't act soon, it would be too late. He pressed his hand lightly over the discolored spot again, and realized the Queen's condition might involve an organ hemorrhage. He just had no way of knowing which organ, or how to repair it. The scan data was incomplete, and every passing second meant further deterioration. Without enough information, Monroe's mind spun. Could he stabilize her by treating the injury like a trauma wound in a human patient? It was a gamble, a massive one, but he had nothing else to go on. "Listen," Monroe said, standing and turning to the alien nobles. "I'll be honest. I don't know your Queen's biology. I don't know what I'll find once I open her up, but I can try something. It might not be perfect, but it's her best chance." A murmur rippled through the room. The advisor's expression darkened. "You mean to cut her open? That is unthinkable." Monroe's jaw tightened, and not doing anything is certain death. The room fell silent. The nobles exchanged glances, their unease palpable. Monroe knew how absurd this seemed to them, entrusting their Queen's life to a human doctor who was about to perform blind surgery on one of the galaxy's most revered beings. Finally, the advisor gave a reluctant nod. "Do what you must. But if she dies, so will your reputation, and your species standing among us. No pressure," Monroe thought grimly. He retrieved a scalpel from his kit, took a deep breath, and leaned over the Queen's fragile form. "Let's get to work." As he made the first incision, the translucent fluid surrounding the Queen shimmered in response, almost as if aware of his intrusion. Monroe's heart raced as he peeled back the damaged chitin with care, exposing a glimpse of alien tissue beneath. It was unlike anything he'd seen before. Veins glowed faintly, and clusters of unknown organs throbbed irregularly. Monroe fought the urge to panic. There was no time for hesitation. His instincts would have to guide him through what science could not. With each precise movement, he began to search for the source of the problem, hoping, praying that luck and ingenuity would be enough to save an alien Queen's life. Dr. Elias Monroe's hands worked quickly and precisely, despite the surge of adrenaline coursing through him. The chitin plates on the Queen's abdomen peeled back to reveal an intricate mass of pulsating tissue, glowing softly under the sterile lights of the operating room. Nothing in his medical training had prepared him for this. The Queen's organs resembled nothing from Earth biology. Tubular structures spiraled in knots, veins throbbed with an iridescent pulse, and clusters of unknown tissues flickered like bioluminescent coral reefs. For a moment, Monroe stared, stunned by the alien complexity before him. His scanner, though advanced, displayed a blur of incomprehensible readings. "Well," he muttered under his breath, "this is going to be fun." The Azaran nobles stood at the room's edges, watching with a mixture of skepticism and horror. Their antennae twitched with every new movement Monroe made, as if they expected him to shatter their Queen with a careless mistake. The weight of their judgment pressed on him like a physical force. Failure wasn't an option. But then again, Monroe thought, in moments like these, failure never was. He touched the discolored part of the Queen's tissue again, feeling an unsettling give. Beneath the delicate membrane was a pocket of fluid, a hemorrhage. His heart sank. If that rupture spread, the Queen's body would flood with toxins. There wasn't a known guidebook for alien surgery, and Monroe didn't have hours to figure out a step-by-step solution. He needed to improvise, and fast. With a breath to steady himself, Monroe grabbed his portable medkit. Human medical tools weren't made for alien anatomy, but they were all he had. He sterilized a pair of micro-forceps and a surgical probe, switching them on with a soft hum. One of the nobles, the older advisor, stepped forward, antennae bristling with distrust. What is that barbaric instrument?" His voice quivered with anger. "You intend to fix the Queen with crude human tools?" Monroe didn't even look up. "Unless you've got a miracle hidden in your robes, yes. Now either stand back or help me improvise." The advisor hissed in frustration but didn't interfere further. Monroe couldn't afford distractions. He focused, threading his forceps between glowing veins and flickering tissues, gently probing the damaged organ. He recognized something resembling fluid buildup, a hemorrhage, but it was encased in a jelly-like membrane that resisted even the gentlest pressure. He'd need to drain it carefully without rupturing the surrounding tissue. "Okay," Monroe muttered. "What are you hiding, little rupture?" He carefully inserted the tip of the probe, guiding it between the tissue layers. A flick of his wrist activated a micro-pump, usually reserved for drawing fluid samples from human patients. It whirred softly as it began to extract the strange, iridescent fluid. For a fleeting moment, everything seemed stable. The Queen's vital signs, erratic as they were, held steady. Monroe exhaled, a glimmer of hope igniting in his chest, and then everything went wrong. The Queen's body convulsed, her vital signs crashing. Alarms blared from Monroe's scanner. Her immune system had triggered a violent response, treating his tools as invasive threats. Strange biochemical reactions rippled through her glowing veins, the tissues around the probe swelling with alarming speed. "Damn it!" Monroe hissed, yanking the probe out before the swelling could worsen. The Queen's breathing became ragged, each exhale a wet rasp. Her immune system was killing her faster than the injury itself. He grabbed his medkit, rifling through the contents. There was no time for second-guessing. He needed something to suppress the immune response, something adaptable, even if it wasn't designed for alien physiology. Then it hit him. Cortisol. In humans, cortisol regulated the immune system under stress. If he could synthesize an equivalent hormone on the spot, it might calm the Queen's body enough to buy him more time. It was a crazy idea. But crazy ideas were what Monroe excelled at. He rummaged through the ship's emergency supplies, searching for anything that could work. His eyes landed on a small vial of liquid, the Izaran equivalent of adrenaline, used to stabilize patients in critical conditions. It wasn't exactly cortisol, but Monroe figured it might act as a makeshift analog. "This is probably a bad idea," Monroe muttered, loading the substance into a micro-injector. He pressed the injector against the Queen's side, releasing the dose. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the Queen's spasms slowed. Her breathing steadied. Monroe's scanner beeped softly. Her immune system was stabilizing. At least for now. Relief washed over him, but the job wasn't done yet. He still had to patch the rupture before it bled out again. He pulled back the translucent membrane surrounding the organ and located the source of the hemorrhage. An internal vessel had burst, leaking toxic fluid into the Queen's bloodstream. It was a clean tear, but repairing it would be difficult without specialized tools. Monroe scanned the room, searching for inspiration. His gaze landed on a strange, organic-looking adhesive tube resting among the alien medical equipment, a bioresin, likely used by the Izarans to seal wounds. Perfect. He grabbed the tube and squeezed a thin line of bioresin along the torn vessel. It hardened instantly, fusing the tissue back together. Monroe ran the scanner over the area again. The rupture was sealed, and the flow of toxic fluid had stopped. For the first time since he'd started the procedure, Monroe allowed himself to hope. The Queen's vital signs were stabilizing, albeit slowly. He gently replaced the chitin plates, securing them with delicate sutures made from the same bioresin. "She's not out of the woods yet," Monroe said, wiping sweat from his brow. "But if she makes it through the next hour, she'll live." The room was eerily silent. The Izaran nobles stared at him with a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. The advisor, still bristling with distrust, stepped forward. "You've performed adequately, but this reckless display was anything but dignified." Monroe shot him a tired glare. "Yeah? Well, dignified wasn't going to save her life." He slumped into a nearby chair, exhausted but relieved. The hardest part was over. For now, the Queen's body was stable, though fragile. All that was left was monitoring her recovery and hoping her immune system didn't rebel again. As Monroe rested, one of the younger nobles approached him cautiously. You did something none of our physicians could." "How?" Monroe shrugged. "Instinct, improvisation, and a lot of luck." The young noble tilted his head, antennae twitching with curiosity. "Luck seems to favor you, human." Monroe chuckled softly. "That? Or I just have a knack for solving problems no one else wants to touch." The Queen stirred slightly, a faint ripple in the pool surrounding her. Her breathing remained steady. Monroe knew there was still a long road ahead. Recovery wouldn't be easy, but for the first time since he'd arrived, he felt like they had a fighting chance. He glanced at the advisor, who still looked unimpressed. "I assume you'll want to criticize me some more?" The advisor sniffed. "We shall see. If the Queen survives the night, perhaps your methods will warrant further scrutiny." Monroe leaned back, closing his eyes for a brief moment. "Scrutiny's fine. Just make sure you tell her who saved her life when she wakes up." The room fell silent again, the tension lingering like a stubborn fog. But beneath it all, Monroe felt the faint stirrings of something new, respect, grudging though it was, and that, he knew, was a start. The alien Queen's body lay motionless in the shimmering liquid, her vitals wavering on the edge of disaster. Dr. Elias Monroe could feel the tension in the room rising, the air thick with expectation. The assembled Izaran nobles stood rigid, their wide, dark eyes fixed on the human doctor who now held their Queen's life in his hands. No one spoke, but the weight of their gaze was palpable. Monroe knew he had only moments to act before they lost all faith in him. As Monroe monitored the Queen's vital signs, a sudden warning beep echoed from his scanner. Her heart rate plummeted, and her oxygen levels dropped dangerously low. She was slipping fast. His temporary fix with the bioresin had bought them time, but now a new crisis was unfolding, something he hadn't accounted for. Monroe's gut clenched. The Queen's body was shutting down. Not now, not when we're this close, he whispered, grabbing the scanner to run another diagnostic, but it was no good. The alien biology remained stubbornly unreadable to his human instruments. It was like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. A voice broke through the tense silence, a sharp, irritated hiss from the royal advisor. She grows weaker, human. If you cannot save her, step away and let her die with dignity. Monroe turned, locking eyes with the alien. If you want to let her die, go right ahead. I won't stop you. But if you want her to live, you're going to have to trust me. The advisor's antennae twitched, a flicker of doubt crossing his insect-like features. Monroe didn't wait for a response. He turned back to the Queen, running through every possible scenario in his mind. The rapid decline in oxygen suggested respiratory failure, but he hadn't seen any obvious damage to her airways during the initial examination. Something deeper was going on, something he'd missed. Monroe knelt closer, pressing his ear against the Queen's abdomen. At first, he heard nothing but the soft hum of her liquid cocoon, but then, a faint, irregular vibration, like a fluttering heartbeat beneath layers of tissue. His eyes widened. The Queen's respiratory system wasn't failing. Something inside her was interfering with it. His mind raced. Could it be a secondary organ? Maybe something akin to a diaphragm or lung sac. He had no idea how Izaran biology worked, but he knew he needed to act now. He grabbed his scalpel, carefully reopening the section he'd closed with bioresin. As the chitin plates peeled back once more, Monroe's eyes locked onto a previously unnoticed structure, a cluster of sac-like organs hidden beneath a translucent membrane, one of which was visibly collapsed and leaking fluid. Gotcha, Monroe whispered. The collapsed sac seemed to be the source of the Queen's respiratory failure. If he could repair it, there was a chance she could stabilize. But the sac's delicate structure was unlike anything he'd encountered. It looked as though even the slightest mistake would cause irreparable damage. Monroe thought fast. Human medical procedures wouldn't work here. He needed to think outside the box. Okay, he muttered, glancing around the room. I need something sticky, some kind of adhesive that won't trigger another immune response. The alien nobles exchanged uncertain glances. One of the younger attendants stepped forward, holding a container of shimmering liquid. This is silk resin, the attendant said nervously. It is used for mending fractures in our kind, but it is untested for internal organs. Monroe grabbed the container without hesitation. We're testing it now. He loaded the silk resin into an injector, steadying his hand as he aimed it at the damaged sac. With careful precision, he applied a thin layer of the adhesive, holding his breath as it bonded with the delicate tissue. For a tense moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the collapsed sac began to reinflate, its rhythmic flutter synchronizing with the Queen's shallow breaths. Monroe's heart pounded as the scanner beeped softly, indicating a slight but crucial improvement in her oxygen levels. We're not done yet, he muttered, grabbing a makeshift clamp to secure the sac in place while the adhesive set. His fingers moved deftly, guided more by instinct than knowledge. Every second felt like a lifetime. But finally, the repair held. The Queen's vitals began to stabilize, her breathing becoming deeper and more regular. Monroe leaned back, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. That should hold, he whispered. Before he could relax, a sudden commotion erupted behind him. The royal advisor surged forward, antennae flaring with outrage. What have you done? He snarled. You used an experimental substance on our Queen without permission. If this fails, if I hadn't, she'd be dead. Monroe snapped, rising to his feet. His exhaustion gave way to anger. I didn't have the luxury of tradition or second opinions. I had to make a call, and it worked. The advisor hissed, but before he could respond, a soft murmur filled the room. The Queen stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, glowing faintly as they focused on Monroe. For a moment, she simply gazed at him, her expression unreadable. Then, in a voice as fragile as glass, she whispered, You saved me. The room fell into stunned silence. The nobles stared in disbelief, their rigid postures softening with shock and something akin to admiration. Even the advisor, despite his fury, was momentarily speechless. Monroe knelt beside the Queen, checking her vitals one last time. Take it easy, he said gently. You're not out of the woods yet, but you're going to be okay. The Queen's lips curled into a faint smile, a gesture so subtle Monroe almost missed it. Thank you, human, she whispered before slipping back into unconsciousness, her body now resting in peaceful stillness. Monroe sat back, wiping sweat from his brow. Relief washed over him. Though he knew the battle wasn't entirely won, the Queen's recovery would take time, and there was always a chance of complications. But for now, he'd done the impossible. He'd given her a fighting chance. The nobles remained quiet, processing what they had witnessed. Finally, the young attendant who had offered the silk resin stepped forward, his voice filled with hesitant awe. "You defied every rule of medicine we know, and you succeeded." Monroe shrugged, too tired to argue. "Sometimes rules are meant to be broken." The royal advisor, still bristling, gave a begrudging nod. "You acted recklessly, human, but perhaps there is wisdom in your madness." Monroe smirked. "I'll take that as a compliment." As the room settled, Monroe stood, stretching his stiff limbs. He knew the Queen's recovery would need constant monitoring, but for now he could breathe easy. He had stared down the impossible, and for once, the impossible had blinked first. The young noble approached again, his antennae twitching with curiosity. "What will you do now, human?" Monroe chuckled softly. "Get some sleep, if that's allowed. After that, I figure we'll cross that bridge when we get there." The noble nodded, a rare glimmer of respect in his gaze. "Your methods are strange, but effective. Perhaps there is more we can learn from you." Monroe smiled, exhaustion tugging at the edges of his mind. "Well, let's hope you never need another emergency surgery. But if you do," he glanced at the Queen, now resting peacefully, "I'll be here." The Queen's recovery was slow but steady. The rhythmic beeping of Monroe's medical scanner confirmed what he suspected. Her vitals were stabilizing with each passing hour. Her breathing was regular, and the fluid buildup that had nearly suffocated her showed no signs of returning. Still, Monroe knew better than to relax completely. Alien physiology was unpredictable, and every small victory could unravel without warning. He sat by the Queen's bedside, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. The translucent pool surrounding her glimmered under the sterile lights, reflecting the eerie beauty of her intricate anatomy. She looked peaceful now, her delicate chitin glimmering with soft luminescence, far removed from the chaotic moments of the surgery. Just as Monroe began to lean back in his chair, hoping to steal a few moments of rest, the chamber doors hissed open. A delegation of nobles marched in, led by the ever-irritated royal advisor. Their faces were grim, their antennae twitching with barely contained disapproval. "You have overstepped, human," the advisor declared, his voice sharp with accusation. "Your actions may have stabilized her condition, but they have violated centuries of tradition. The Queen's body is sacred. You had no right to perform such barbaric procedures." Monroe pinched the bridge of his nose, fighting the urge to snap. "If I hadn't violated tradition, she'd be dead. I used what I had and did what I could. You're welcome, by the way." The advisor's antennae quivered with rage, but before he could respond, another noble stepped forward, a younger one who had witnessed the entire procedure. His expression was softer, more curious than hostile. "He saved her life," the younger noble said cautiously. "We must acknowledge that, no matter how unconventional his methods." Murmurs spread among the delegation. Some nobles nodded reluctantly, while others muttered in disapproval. Monroe could feel the tension thickening in the air, a volatile mixture of grudging respect, fear, and outrage. The Queen's survival should have been a cause for celebration, but instead, it had ignited a debate that cut to the heart of the Izeran traditions. Monroe crossed his arms, bracing himself. He knew this kind of backlash was inevitable. Alien cultures, especially monarchies, thrived on ritual and reverence. To them, his life-saving surgery was likely seen as reckless desecration, a necessary evil perhaps, but an evil nonetheless. The advisor stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You may have bought her time, but at what cost? If she relapses, it will be your fault. If there are consequences to your meddling, you will answer for them." Monroe stood, meeting the advisor's glare without flinching. "If she relapses, I'll treat her again. If there are consequences, I'll deal with them. But let's not pretend you brought me here for any other reason than desperation. You needed someone who didn't care about your traditions. That's why I'm here." The room fell silent, the weight of Monroe's words hanging in the air. The nobles exchanged uneasy glances, some visibly uncomfortable with how close to the truth he had come. The younger noble, standing slightly apart from the others, gave Monroe a subtle nod, an unspoken gesture of agreement. Before the conversation could escalate further, the Queen stirred. Her movements were slow and deliberate, but unmistakably deliberate. The nobles gasped in unison, their antennae twitching with disbelief. Monroe quickly stepped to her side, scanning her vitals as she blinked her eyes open, the glowing orbs focusing on him with quiet intensity. "You," she whispered, her voice weak but clear. "You saved me." Monroe gave a small, tired smile. "Yeah, it wasn't pretty, but we got there." The Queen's gaze shifted to the assembled nobles, her expression unreadable. "He did what none of our physicians could," she murmured. "He acted without fear, and without hesitation. The advisor's expression twisted with barely concealed frustration, but he bowed his head in deference. Your Majesty, we only wish to ensure your safety. His methods saved my life. The Queen interrupted softly, yet with undeniable authority, and for that I am grateful. The room grew still, the tension melting into a mixture of awe and confusion. The Queen's words carried the weight of finality. No one dared challenge her. Monroe watched the nobles as they absorbed her statement, some looking uncomfortable, others visibly relieved. It was clear that the Queen's survival had shifted the narrative, at least for now. The Queen turned her attention back to Monroe. You risked much, human. More than we had any right to ask of you. Monroe shrugged, exhaustion catching up with him. It's what I do. If there's a life on the line, I don't think about much else. The Queen smiled faintly, the expression delicate but genuine. You have my thanks and my trust. The advisor stiffened, his antennae jerking in shock. Your Majesty, granting trust to an outsider is my prerogative, the Queen said firmly, cutting him off. She looked back at Monroe, her glowing eyes reflecting the liquid surrounding her, and I intend to honor it. Before Monroe could respond, the Queen raised a hand, summoning one of the younger attendants. The attendant approached with a small, ornate object, an intricately carved medallion that shimmered with alien symbols. The Queen extended it toward Monroe. This is a token of gratitude, she said. It is rare that we grant such honors to those outside our kind. Carry it with you as a symbol of my trust, and as a reminder of what you have accomplished. Monroe hesitated for a moment before accepting the medallion. It was surprisingly light, cool to the touch, and radiated a subtle warmth as if alive. He turned it over in his hand, marveling at the delicate craftsmanship. Thank you, Monroe said, unsure of what else to say. I wasn't expecting this. The Queen gave a faint smile. Neither were we. The tension in the room eased, though the advisor still looked displeased. Monroe could feel the weight of the alien nobility's gaze shifting, not entirely toward acceptance, but toward something close to respect. He had saved their Queen, and whether they liked it or not, they couldn't deny what he had done. As the Queen settled back into the liquid cocoon, her breathing steady and peaceful, Monroe turned toward the delegation. She'll need time to recover, he said, addressing the nobles, but she's out of immediate danger. Keep her comfortable, monitor her vitals, and call me if anything changes. The advisor gave a reluctant nod. We will consider your recommendations. Monroe smirked, too tired to argue. Yeah, you do that. He glanced back at the Queen one last time, feeling a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion. The ordeal was over. For now, but Monroe knew that this was only the beginning. His actions had stirred something within the alien court, challenging centuries of tradition. Whether that would lead to acceptance or resentment remained to be seen. As Monroe made his way toward the exit, the younger noble who had supported him earlier fell into step beside him. You know, the noble said quietly, you've changed more than just one life today. Monroe gave a tired grin. That tends to happen when you save a queen. The noble chuckled softly. You'll be remembered for this, human. For better or worse. Monroe shrugged, slipping the medallion into his pocket. I'll take my chances. With that, he stepped through the chamber doors, leaving the nobles and the weight of their traditions behind. In the days that followed, Dr. Elias Monroe's world shifted in ways he never anticipated. The Queen's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. Under his close watch, her breathing remained steady, her strange bioluminescent organs pulsing with life once more. As the news spread throughout the Izaran Empire, it became clear that his unorthodox intervention had saved more than just a life. It had altered the political landscape of the galaxy. Monroe remained at the Queen's side for a few more days, conducting follow-up checks, monitoring her progress, and making adjustments to her care when necessary. Though the alien nobles were initially wary, they began to seek his advice with increasing frequency, begrudgingly acknowledging his expertise. Even the advisor, whose distrust had been evident from the beginning, began to speak to Monroe with a clipped but unmistakable respect. One morning, just as Monroe finished his daily rounds, he was summoned to the Queen's chamber. This time, she was sitting upright, her chitinous body glowing softly with restored vitality. The Queen's eyes, still luminous with the same serene intensity, fixed on Monroe as he approached. You've done far more than save my life, she said in a voice that was now stronger, though still laced with a strange musical quality. "You've given us all reason to reconsider what we thought we knew about your kind." Monroe shifted uncomfortably. "Just doing my job, Your Majesty." The Queen's gaze softened. "It is rare for an outsider to be given the honor of serving within our court. Rarer still for one to succeed where others have failed. I would ask you something, Dr. Monroe." He inclined his head slightly, sensing the importance of her words. "Of course." The Queen extended a delicate, segmented hand toward him, her expression thoughtful. "I offer you a position as my personal physician, an honorary role should you choose to accept it. You would have the freedom to leave whenever you wish, but I would have you stay, to teach, to heal, and perhaps to help us see the world differently." Monroe blinked, taken aback by the offer. He hadn't expected anything beyond a brief thank you and a swift return to his station on the Horizon outpost. The idea of staying, of becoming part of this strange, ancient court, was both thrilling and daunting. "I appreciate the offer, Your Majesty," he said carefully, "but I'm not exactly the kind to fit in with nobility. I'm just a doctor who got lucky." The Queen gave a small, enigmatic smile. "And that is precisely why you belong here." Monroe let the words hang in the air, weighing his options. He had spent most of his career on the fringes, treating patients no one else would touch, solving problems that others refused to confront. But here, amid the alien grandeur of the Izaran court, he had found something he hadn't realized he was searching for: purpose. A chance to do more than patch wounds and move on, a chance to make a difference. Before he could respond, the chamber doors opened, and the advisor entered, his expression as unreadable as ever. He bowed deeply to the Queen before turning his sharp gaze on Monroe. "The council has convened," the advisor announced. "They wish to discuss the implications of your actions, Doctor." Monroe raised an eyebrow. "Implications?" The advisor's antennae twitched. "Your success has sparked debate. Some see it as a sign of hope. Others fear it sets a dangerous precedent." Monroe sighed. "Let me guess. They're not thrilled about a human shaking things up." The Queen inclined her head gracefully. "Change is never easy, Dr. Monroe, but it is often necessary." With that, she rose from her seat, her movements fluid and graceful. "Come," she said, gesturing for him to follow. "It is time you addressed the council." Monroe followed her through the winding halls of the palace, flanked by attendants and nobles. As they approached the Grand Council chamber, he could hear the low murmur of voices, heated discussions carried out in the melodic tones of the Izaran language. When the doors swung open, the room fell silent, all eyes turning toward him. The council chamber was a vast, domed space filled with iridescent light. Rows of seats were occupied by Izaran nobles, their antennae twitching in anticipation. At the center of the room stood a podium, where Monroe and the Queen took their places. The advisor stepped forward to address the council. "Dr. Monroe's actions have saved the Queen's life," he began, his voice measured, "but his methods have raised questions about tradition, authority, and the role of outsiders in our most sacred matters." A murmur spread through the chamber, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uneasily. Monroe could feel the weight of their scrutiny, but he stood his ground, arms crossed over his chest. "I didn't come here to challenge your traditions," Monroe said, his voice steady but firm. "I came here to save a life, and I did what I had to do, because that's what doctors do. If that makes you uncomfortable, I get it, but if you'd rather stick to tradition and let people die, well, that's not a system I want to be part of." The room fell into stunned silence. The Queen watched him with an expression of quiet approval, her glowing eyes reflecting the light of the chamber. The council members exchanged glances, some clearly taken aback by Monroe's bluntness, while others seemed to consider his words carefully. Finally, one of the elder council members, a female with intricate patterns etched into her chiton, spoke up. "Perhaps it is time we reconsider our ways. Dr. Monroe has shown us that wisdom can come from unexpected places." A ripple of agreement spread through the chamber, though not everyone seemed convinced. The advisor remained stiff, but even he couldn't entirely mask the grudging respect in his gaze. The Queen inclined her head toward the council. "We must adapt, or we will wither. Dr. Monroe has given us a gift, a glimpse of what might be possible if we learn to see beyond our traditions." With that, the council session came to a close, and the nobles filed out of the chamber, their antennae flicking thoughtfully. The Queen turned to Monroe, a small smile playing at the edges of her lips. "It seems you've made quite an impression," she said softly. Monroe chuckled. "Yeah, well, I've been told I'm good at that." As they left the chamber together, Monroe felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The decision he had been wrestling with suddenly felt clear. He wasn't just a doctor, he was someone who thrived in the chaos between tradition and innovation. And here, in the heart of an ancient alien empire, he had found a place where he could make a real difference. "I'll stay," Monroe said quietly, slipping the medallion from his pocket and turning it over in his hands. "At least for a little while." The Queen's smile deepened. "Then welcome to your new beginning, Doctor." And so it was that a human doctor, armed with nothing more than instinct, ingenuity, and a refusal to back down, became a symbol of change in a galaxy bound by tradition. His story spread far and wide, inspiring others to challenge the boundaries of what was possible. For in the end, it wasn't just a queen's life he had saved. It was the hope for a future where courage and compassion knew no limits.